History as it happens, October 31st, 2023. The oil weapon.
Surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground. The Egyptians apparently have taken control of at least a portion of the east bank of the Suez.
Kissinger called the foreign ministers of Egypt and Israel to urge them to end the fighting as quickly as possible.
In 1973, the big Middle East producers cut off oil shipments to major...
People can no longer afford to run cars that do 12 miles to the gallon.
In the Dallas area today, dealers raised prices to more than 40 cents a gallon.
I think what we have as an oil weapon is far more greater than what we did. What we did is nothing at all.
Both sides are at fault. Both sides need to start negotiating. That is our position. We're not pro-Israel, and we're not pro-Arab, and we're not any more pro-Arab because they have oil and Israel hasn't.
50 Octobers ago, Arab oil producers agreed to an embargo, sending oil prices soaring, upending American politics and energy policy. The embargo, the oil weapon, was used to punish the U.S. for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Today, with Israel at war again and the Palestinian problem still unresolved, would Saudi Arabia or any Arab state unsheath the oil weapon again? That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
That's a good reminder that even though an embargo like 73 probably isn't going to happen again, American consumers are still exposed to the impact of high oil prices, and events in the Middle East still affect those prices. So Americans certainly notice when the price of gasoline goes up.
I would simply say that in the short term, we face a problem with regard to energy, heating, for example, this winter, just as we thought we faced a problem of gasoline this summer and the possibility...
In early September 1973, about a month before Egypt and Syria would surprise attack Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, President Nixon held a news conference on energy.
The United States would prefer to continue to import oil, petroleum products from the Mideast, from Venezuela, from Canada, from other countries. But also, we are keenly aware of the fact that no nation, and particularly no industrial nation, must be in a position of being at the mercy of any other nation by having its energy supplies suddenly cut off.
Well, as you can tell from that remark, talk of an Arab oil embargo was in the air. In August, Nixon had delivered a major address on the burgeoning energy crisis. Yes, before the embargo, Americans' unquenchable thirst for oil was smacking up against a global problem of limited supply.
I am tonight announcing the following steps. First, I am directing that industries and utilities which use coal, which is our most abundant resource, be prevented from converting from coal to oil. Efforts will also be made to convert power plants from the use of coal or oil to the use of coal. Second, we are allocating reduced quantities of fuel for aircraft.
So although Nixon knew an Arab oil embargo would cause major problems, he decided against the advice of his advisors to send Israel military support during the Yom Kippur War, which began on October 6 and ended 19 days later with a ceasefire brokered by the United States and Soviet Union and proposed by the UN Security Council. To punish the United States for backing the Jewish state, Saudi Arabia led the Arab oil producers to cut off oil shipments to the U.S., the Netherlands, Portugal, Rhodesia, and South Africa. It was the oil weapon, and we're still living with the consequences of this first oil shock today. The memories have lasted. In this AP archive interview from November 1973, Saudi Arabia's oil minister Ahmed Yamani says the oil weapon was pointed right at the West's weakness, its dependence on Saudi Arabian oil.
I think what we have as an oil weapon is far more greater than what we did. What we did is nothing at all. I think we can cut down production to, let's say, 20%. Instead of 25%, it will be 80%. You think Europe or Japan or the United States can survive with this? Maybe the United States, they have their own local supply. They are in a much better position than Europe and Japan. But I don't know to what extent Europe and Japan will get together and join the Americans in any kind of measures, because your whole economy will definitely collapse all of a sudden. If the Americans are thinking of a military action, this is also another possibility. But then this is a suicide.
So could you imagine a Saudi official talking that way today? I can't. For starters, the U.S. doesn't need Saudi oil the way it used to. And despite massive anger on the Arab street directed at Israel for its bombing campaign in Gaza, there's no talk in Riyadh about wielding the oil weapon again. The world is a different place today than it was in 1973. Well, that should be obvious, right? But it hasn't stopped some commentators or editorial writers from drawing parallels between today's war and the war 50 Octobers ago. This podcast is all about the historical origins of current events, but part of what we do here is to avoid mistaken comparisons. Rather, we can learn something by recognizing the major differences between past and present. And in this episode, that means trying to understand the oil market and how it's changed over the past 50 years. Meantime, please stay up to date on the Israel-Hamas war at WashingtonTimes.com. I'll return to the war itself on the podcast soon. Peter Bergen has agreed to return to discuss comparisons between 9/11 in the U.S. and 10/7 in Israel. That conversation is coming your way in November. Back to oil. Victor McFarland is a historian of energy and U.S. Middle East relations at the University of Missouri, and he is the author of Oil Powers, A History of the U.S.-Saudi Alliance. Hello, Victor McFarland.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
Well, you come highly recommended from David Painter, the Dean of Historians of Oil and U.S. Foreign Policy. So no pressure, okay?
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Well, as I mentioned to you when we were arranging to have this conversation, anniversaries do have a way of concentrating our minds on a particular event. So what was it? 1973. That is 50 Octobers ago, we have the Yom Kippur War, and it drew immediate comparisons to what's going on today in Israel because it was another surprise attack, this time by Hamas, a terrorist attack on Israel. But there's also been a lot of commentary about how the oil weapon may or may not be used. And just as I was signing on to talk to you here, here's a headline that came over. The World Bank reported oil prices could be pushed into uncharted waters if the violence between Israel and Hamas widens, which could result in increased food prices worldwide. But here's a different headline that was an Associated Press story. Here's a CNN business story. Oil prices fell again today as concerns about the health of the global economy outweighed fears that Israel's move to expand its military operations could lead to a wider conflict. So why don't we just start here? Your take on why oil prices, well, they're coming down according to this headline, but they haven't shot up as a result of the war.
It's a very different situation from 1973, where oil prices, at least the official oil price, what they call the posted price, quadrupled in the couple of months after the 1973 war. And we haven't seen anything like that with the current fighting between Israel and Hamas. And one big reason for that is that fighting now is much more localized. In 1973, Israel was fighting Egypt and Syria, and the rest of the Arab world, at least politically, was lined up behind Egypt and Syria as well. And that was one of the reasons for the oil embargo and the production cuts that sent oil prices increasing. And today, there's nothing of that scale. So the price of oil hasn't been affected very much, certainly not on anything like the scale in 1973.
Yeah, and the World Bank painted different scenarios under one called a large disruption, comparable to the Arab oil embargo of 73, according to this AP story. The global oil supply would shrink by 6 to 8 million barrels per day, and prices could go up by 56% to 75%, or to $157 a barrel, according to the report. Now, again, this is just a projection based on a possibility, but it says nothing in here about a deliberate embargo. It just sounds like, the potential of a destabilizing war could disrupt supply. Do you share those concerns?
Well, that's a hypothetical situation, and I think they're right that if up to 6 million barrels a day were taken off the world oil market, prices would certainly go up. But they haven't painted a very explicit scenario of how that would happen. And I think it's unlikely that we would lose that much oil supply. It's possible that there could be a smaller disruption. So maybe the most likely scenario is that Iran, as a country that supported Hamas in the past, if it gets involved in the fighting somehow, if Israel were to carry out a strike on Iran, or if the United States and Israel were to decide that they needed to take action against Iran. Iran's exporting something like 1.5 or 2 million barrels a day right now, and there could be a more stringent sanctions package or fighting that would remove some of that oil supply from the market. So it's possible that that could happen and send prices up, but we haven't seen anything like that yet. And even if it did, it wouldn't be on the scale of the 1973 war.
So if we're going to talk about 1973, why don't we start with the Saudis, because they were so important to those events, using the oil weapon against the United States because the U.S. supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States was resupplying the Israeli military as the Soviet Union was resupplying Israel's enemies. King Faisal at the time had previously rejected using the oil weapon to achieve the Arab world and Saudi Arabia's various objectives, which included punishing Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians. Why had the Saudis avoided the oil weapon or using the oil weapon previous to 73?
Saudi Arabia was pulled in different directions. They were an Arab country. They have a sense of solidarity with the rest of the Arab world. And the Saudi leadership was also subject to political pressure from the rest of the Arab world to support fellow Arab countries against Israel. During the 1967 war and during the 1973 war, both times Saudi Arabia came under heavy pressure from Egypt in particular to support the common Arab cause. So that was an argument for participating in an embargo and not selling oil to the United States, which was aiding Israel and sending weapons to Israel, especially in 1973. On the other side, Saudi Arabia needed oil exports for its income. And so the Saudi leadership was reluctant to interrupt those exports. And they also had a close political relationship with the United States. The United States sold arms to Saudi Arabia, supported them diplomatically, provided technical aid, and helped the development of the Saudi economy, did a lot of trade with Saudi Arabia. So for those reasons, Saudi Arabia was very reluctant to alienate the United States and to carry out an embargo. So every time there was an Arab-Israeli confrontation, Saudi Arabia was caught in an uncomfortable place where the Saudi government both wanted to show that they were in solidarity with the rest of the Arab world and wanted to maintain the relationship with the United States.
You mentioned 67 and a short embargo there by the Saudis and other oil producers. It hurt them. It hurt the Saudis. And I have Daniel Yergin's massive book here, The Prize, which is a fantastic book. He's talking about the summer of 72, so this is more than a year before the Yom Kippur War. Sadat, Egypt's new leader, who got along better with Faisal than had his predecessor Nasser. Sadat called on the Saudis to start using oil for political purposes, manipulate oil supplies, and Faisal told him, get lost. That is dangerous to even think of it. What changes his mind in 73? Obviously, Sadat was putting pressure on him, but he could have still said no.
He could have. And Saudi Arabia was very reluctant most of the time to support an embargo against the United States. And that was even true after the beginning of the war in 1973. So October 6th, 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israeli forces in the territories that Israel had occupied in 67, 6 years before, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, and immediately started pressing the Arab oil producers, especially Saudi Arabia, the biggest Arab oil producer, to support the common Arab war effort with an embargo against supporters of Israel, especially the United States. But even after that fighting started, it took Saudi Arabia more than a week and a half to carry out any serious oil action against the United States. It wasn't until October 17th that Saudi Arabia and a group of other Arab oil exporters agreed to reduce their oil production as a way of sending a message to the United States and other oil importers that supported Israel. So that tells you something about Saudi Arabia's reluctance to get involved. If they waited a week and a half to take any serious action after the war started. If it had been like 1967, that war only lasted 6 days. And so the war would have been over before Saudi Arabia did anything. And it so happened that the 1973 war lasted longer, certainly longer than Israel expected. And so they started running out of military supplies and had to be resupplied by the United States with ammunition and
the war was about
material.
3 weeks long or so, something like that.
It's roughly 3 weeks, 2.5, something like that.
Yeah, and the oil embargo only lasted until early of 74, so it was only in effect for a few months, but it had a profound impact on the world and on the United States. Sorry to interject there, but I do want to now talk about what was going on inside the United States. We've already talked a little context about the Arab world and Saudi Arabia avoiding the oil weapon prior to 73. Prior to 1973, in the U.S., increasingly dependent on oil imports, much different than had been the case in the 1950s and the 1960s. Why was the U.S. economy so dependent on oil imports by this time?
Right. That's the big shift that makes the United States vulnerable to oil supply disruption in 73. The most important reason is that American oil consumption had just gone up massively. Oil had been relatively cheap for a long time. The price had stayed very stable for a long time, about a quarter century after World War II. The price hardly budged, at least by the standards of later decades when it got more volatile. So American energy consumers didn't have much reason to reduce their energy consumption. So you think back to the cars that Americans drove in those days, and they were big, heavy cars that tended to get poor fuel economy. Americans moved out to the suburbs, and detached single-family homes use more energy than smaller apartments or smaller homes. Oil was even being burned to generate electricity, which we hardly ever do now in the United States. But back then it was so cheap and so plentiful that it was burned in power plants as a substitute for coal or natural gas. So for all of those reasons, the American consumption of oil went up dramatically during the quarter century up to 1973, and that helped make the United States more dependent on imports. The other thing that changed was that American oil production peaked in 1970 and started to go down for a lot of reasons. But maybe the simplest reason is that the United States is where the modern oil industry began. It was the first country in the world to have a major oil industry. American oil fields had been heavily exploited for a long time. And by 1970, some of the big oil fields were starting to run out, to be depleted. Between 1970 and 73, in particular, the United States became a lot more dependent on imports.
So when Nixon took office in 68 and then he wins re-election in 72, there was something called the Mandatory Oil Import Program that had been around for quite a bit in the U.S., right? What was this and how did this cause problems before we get to 73?
It was a program that started under Eisenhower, and the idea was to keep foreign oil imports out of the United States. Some imports were allowed in, but the quantity was limited. And this tells you something about how different the mindset was in the 50s and 60s versus the 70s. In the 50s and 60s, American policymakers thought there was so much cheap oil out there in the rest of the world, especially coming from the Middle East, that if it were allowed into the United States, it would hurt American domestic oil producers in places like Texas or California. And there'd be this flood of cheap imports, which would have been good for consumers, but bad for the American domestic oil companies. So they kept some of those imports out of the country. They limited the total amount that could be imported per year as a way of protecting the domestic oil industry. Officially, the reason was for national security. The United States needed a strong industry, but of course there were big economic benefits for those companies as well. It helped them charge higher prices. By the early 1970s, that system didn't work anymore because American domestic oil production was declining, and there really wasn't an alternative to allowing a lot more oil imports into the United States. So Nixon effectively scrapped the program before the 1973 embargo started.
Was there a growing sense by this time that the U.S. was vulnerable to potential disruptions in the global market as our country became more dependent on what at that point was a new source of oil for the U.S., Middle Eastern oil, Arab oil? You know, for young people listening to this conversation who only know the U.S. and foreign policy as being at war in the Middle East for decades now, in the 1970s, the U.S. had no military presence in the Middle East, and the issue of maintaining access to Middle Eastern oil, this is now the first time this is really an issue, right?
It was the first time that the United States worried about getting oil for itself from the Middle East. Other countries had been dependent on Middle East imports for a while, including American allies in Western Europe, NATO allies, and including countries in East Asia, especially Japan. So the United States did start planning scenarios for military intervention in the Middle East and intervening in various ways in the Middle East to keep the oil flowing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But most of that planning was with American allies in mind. The idea was that oil had to keep flowing to Western Europe and East Asia. What changed in the early 70s is that the United States itself, for the first time, became heavily dependent on oil imports, including some imports from the Middle East. And so the whole question became much more urgent.
And back in 53, when Mossadegh nationalized the Iranian oil, the lesson from that, at least from the U.S. and British perspective, to these countries was don't mess with the oil, right? Or else you'll turn into another Mossadegh. Well, times had changed, didn't they?
Absolutely. And Nixon gave that warning in a press conference before the 1973 embargo. He essentially said, to those Arab oil producers out there who are thinking of cutting off oil supplies to the United States, remember what happened to Mossadegh. He learned that oil without a market wasn't any good.
As Mr. Mossadegh learned many, many years ago, doesn't do a country much good. We in Europe are the market. And I think that the responsible Arab leaders will see to it, that if they continue to up the price, if they continue to expropriate, if they do expropriate without fair compensation, the inevitable result is that they will lose their markets and other sources will be developed.
At that point, in the early 1950s, there was so much surplus oil supply in the world that the United States and Britain could lead an oil boycott against Iran when Mossadegh nationalized the Iranian oil industry. So they stopped buying oil from Iran and could pretty easily get oil from other countries. By the 1970s, that had changed very dramatically. There wasn't much spare oil supply left in the world. The threat that Nixon made against the Arab oil producers, that we can do the same thing we did with Mossadegh and do without your oil completely, that wasn't a credible threat by the early 70s anymore. That was a bluff. Of course, the United States and Britain also supported a coup against Mossadegh. So if you read between the lines of what Nixon was saying, there's a hint of that threat too, that if you cross us, we can have your government overthrown. But in the early 70s, that wasn't a very feasible option for the United States either.
Also at this time, these Arab states, Saudi Arabia, maybe some others, wanted to assert themselves more. They wanted a larger share as the price of oil started going up, right? They wanted a larger share of the profits, but the oil companies weren't run by the Arab states. They were foreign owned, U.S. owned, right? Aramco at that point was not a Saudi company like it is today.
That's exactly right. The oil industry was dominated by American and British companies, and they're the ancestors of most of the biggest oil companies today. So if you think of what are the most powerful oil companies in the world, you think ExxonMobil, you think BP, you think Shell, Chevron. These are all the descendants of what were called the Seven Sisters, the biggest oil companies in the world. And they were overwhelmingly U.S. and British owned. So from the perspective of a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran, their argument was this oil is our own natural resource. It's coming from under our own soil, and yet it's foreign companies that decide how much gets produced and control the way that oil is pumped and make much of the profit from selling that oil. So that was a long-standing dispute. Those countries had all been pressing for a bigger share of the profits and more control over the oil for decades before the early 1970s. And the embargo coincides with oil-producing countries taking much more control over their own natural resources.
Nixon was warned, right, maybe by Kissinger or somebody, that if you supply the Israelis in the war, this embargo is going to happen. Is that correct?
Many of Nixon's advisors warned him that if the United States supported Israel too directly in 1973, it could lead to an oil embargo. And they were right. But Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, decided to support Israel anyways. They launched a massive airlift of American planes flying directly into Israel and dropping off ammunition and weapons and material that Israel needed in the war. And they did that for a variety of reasons. One important reason was that Israel, they saw as a Cold War ally of the United States. It was armed by the U.S. A win for Israel looked like a win for the U.S., and a win for the Arab countries fighting Israel that were armed by the Soviet Union would have looked like a win for the Soviet Union. So when Nixon ordered the airlift, that was the reason he invoked. He said, we have to maintain American credibility here. And if Israel loses, then American credibility all around the world is going to be shaken.
OPEC and the Saudis, the Arab oil producers, they get together after this happens, after the Yom Kippur War starts and the U.S. supports Israel. The details here are mind-boggling. I did read a paper David Painter wrote some years ago about the meetings of the Arab oil producers and the negotiations and the percentages. I mean, we don't need to get into all the weeds here. The bottom line coming out of these meetings was to totally cut off oil to the U.S. and a handful of other countries. I think the Netherlands was one of them. And then also reduce oil production. So an embargo and a cut in oil production. Is that your take on what the embargo actually was?
That's right. There were a lot of different components to it, and it can get a bit complicated and confusing. Production cuts happened first. So on October 17th, 1973, a group of Arab oil producers get together and decide to start cutting production by a small amount each month. So they promised 5% cuts each month, as long as Israel retained control of the territories it had occupied in 1967. That was a really blunt instrument. It hurt all the oil importing countries equally. So if you were buying oil, it didn't matter if you were supporting Israel or not. You could be the United States, you could be Japan, could be any oil importer. You would have to eventually pay higher prices as a result of this production cut. Separately from that, a few days later, the Arab countries started imposing embargoes on the United States, and they did this one by one, not all as a group. So Abu Dhabi did it earlier than Saudi Arabia, for example. And they totally cut off oil imports to the United States and, as you said, to the Netherlands as well, and a couple of other countries. South Africa was also on the list. So that embargo became the most prominent and the best remembered part of this whole set of sanctions. But the embargo itself wasn't necessarily very effective. The oil companies could redirect oil from non-Arab countries to the United States. Venezuela, for example, or Nigeria, that were also important oil exporters, they kept shipping oil to the United States. This was true of Iran, too. So here it's important to distinguish between OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries that included a whole group of the biggest oil exporters in the world, and then the Arab members of OPEC. It was only the Arab members of OPEC who participated in the embargo, and the others, Venezuela, Iran, etc., they didn't join in. So the embargo itself, it had a big political impact. It was very symbolically important, but economically speaking, it wasn't the most important of these oil sanctions.
So, Victor, I do not claim to understand the oil market then or today. My grasp of economics it's a little bit shaky. But anyway, despite what you just said, the price of oil basically quadruples overnight. And it's not just a pocketbook issue for Americans. I mean, this period, the 73 shock and then the 79 shock after the Iranian Revolution, had a profound impact on American politics. I mean, it lasted throughout the rest of the 1970s. People who are old enough to remember gas lines, etc., Jimmy Carter wearing sweaters on television, not to get ahead of ourselves. But 1973, why did the price of oil skyrocket overnight?
That's a good question. There were a lot of reasons for that. The oil market was already very closely balanced between supply and demand, and the price was already going up. So even if there had been no embargo, there would have been higher oil prices in late 1973. World demand had just been going up so rapidly for the previous quarter century. We talked about how that happened in the United States, but it was even more true in Western Europe or Japan. As they recovered from World War II, they experienced very rapid economic growth, and that meant that they imported a lot more oil. And there weren't very serious efforts to conserve oil during this period, at least not compared to what happened after 73. The price was probably set to increase no matter what happened in the Middle East. But then the war comes on top of that. There's the embargo. There are the production cuts, which take some oil supply off the market that consumers were counting on. And this whole set of events, the war and the embargo and the production cuts, introduced a new sense of uncertainty into the global oil market. I think the psychological factor is very important here, where it was quite shocking to consumers. They didn't know if the oil they were counting on would be available next week or next month, let alone next year. And consumers were bidding to get oil at almost any price for a few months in late 1973. There was a real sense of panic in the world oil market. In that environment, the producers could start charging much higher prices. And the official price that they used to calculate their payments, as you said, it roughly quadruples from the $3 barrel range to more like the $12 barrel range in just 2 months between October and December 1973.
But there was no actual shortage in the U.S., or was there?
There was a shortage, but the effects were out of proportion to the size of the shortage. So the United States wasn't all that dependent on Middle East imports at this point. The U.S. still produced a lot of oil at home, and the oil that it did import, a lot of it came from Canada or Venezuela instead of the Middle East. So in terms of a direct cutoff to the United States, the embargo wasn't as important as you might think. But there was just less oil to go around in the world in general. All the consumers, the U.S., Western Europe, Japan, they were all bidding for the amount of oil that remained. In that environment, the price of oil just shot up.
And also Nixon's policies, right? Didn't they exacerbate the problem?
Absolutely. The United States had a very complicated system of price controls that were designed to shield American consumers from the effects of higher oil prices. Although, truth be told, they were imposed really without even thinking about the impact on oil. Nixon had a general package of wage and price controls that was meant to keep down inflation, which was a big concern in the early 70s. And then when the world price of oil increased so much, American price controls kept the domestic price of oil under the world level in late 1973. And that meant that oil companies had less incentive to bring oil into the United States. If you were going to sell it at a price that was lower than what you were paying on the world market, there was this formula where they charged different prices for old oil and new oil, like whether it was discovered before or after a certain date. So I don't know if we really want to get into that whole, how complicated that was, but let me see if I can sum it up in a way that works for
Sure. Well, the bottom line is that the response to the oil embargo made the problem worse, I think.
That's right. There was a very complicated system of domestic price controls and allocation rules. The federal government was deciding where many of the oil supplies went, and those rules and price controls exacerbated the shortages in the United States, and in particular, the lines at gasoline stations. That when you tell Americans about 1973, this is what they'll remember, those long lines of cars waiting at gas stations. That was in part a result of the Arab production cuts and the increase in the world oil price, but also the result of a system of rules and regulations for distributing the oil in the United States that didn't work very well during this crisis.
So today, the Arab states are making it clear that they are unhappy with the war that Israel is now waging to punish Hamas with the massive bombing of the Gaza Strip. But there's no talk that I have seen anyway about another oil embargo or trying to punish the United States for supporting Israel right now by cutting off oil supply or whatever, right? It would seem impossible that OPEC would do something like that now. I mean, do you agree?
2023 is very different from 1973, and I think that's right, that it's impossible to imagine a repeat of the 1973 embargo. The sense of Arab solidarity that led Saudi Arabia and the other Arab oil producers to support Egypt and Syria in 1973, it doesn't exist between Saudi Arabia and Hamas. If anything, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and some of the other biggest Arab oil producers see Hamas as a problem, as a organization supported by their rival Iran. And so it's hard to imagine a widespread Arab oil embargo to support Hamas. I think that's really out of the question. The world oil market has also changed a lot. So the United States is no longer heavily dependent on oil imports. In fact, the United States is a net exporter now because of the fracking revolution.
Hey, we're number one in the world, right, as far as producing crude oil?
The United States is, yes, the number one oil producer in the world. And the surge in fracking since the early 21st century has played a big role, making the United States less dependent on oil imports. And OPEC as an organization controls less of the global oil market now than it did in the 70s. At the time of the 1973 oil crisis, OPEC produced about half of the world's oil, and now it's more like 35, 36%. And again, I would stress it's not OPEC that carried out the embargo in 1973. OPEC was the organization that concerned itself with oil prices. So OPEC raised the oil price in late 1973, taking advantage of the chaos around the embargo and the Arab production cuts. But OPEC didn't institute the embargo. It was just a group of Arab oil countries that were members of OPEC, but acting outside of OPEC.
And they would then take over the oil infrastructure as well and start operating the oil companies themselves, and they became rather rich. It solidified the rule of these kingdoms, these despots, if you will. Some of these families are still around today, as we know, in Saudi Arabia. So, speaking of the Saudis and your point about how the U.S. is not very dependent on Middle Eastern oil today, this myth does persist, however. And when people see President Biden going to Saudi Arabia, fist bumping Mohammed bin Salman, asking for more Saudi oil production, it creates this idea that we still do heavily rely on the Middle East. What's your take on that?
Saudi Arabia does still have a lot of influence over the price of oil. They have more ability than probably any other country in the world to increase or decrease oil production quickly at will. Where the United States still does ask Saudi Arabia at times to increase oil production when the U.S. thinks that the price of oil is too high, and the Saudi government may or may not listen to those pleas, but the United States tries. The U.S.-Saudi relationship also involves a lot of things other than the price of oil and the supply of oil. Saudi Arabia is an important trade partner of the United States. They purchase American arms. There's military and intelligence cooperation between the two countries. So when Biden or Antony Blinken or other American officials go to meet the Saudi leadership, they talk about a lot of issues other than oil.
Well, it always makes it look like we need the Saudis more than they need us. But it's a relationship. It's not just a one-way street.
It is. It's a two-way street, and it's a complicated relationship. It's been complicated for a long time. The United States and Saudi Arabia have had their disagreements going back to the beginning of that relationship. The first meeting between an American leader and a Saudi leader when FDR met King Abdulaziz in 1945. They disagreed about Zionism before Israel was even formed. But when Zionist settlement was happening in Palestine, the United States and Saudi Arabia already disagreed about that issue. And that disagreement was what drove the oil embargoes in 1967 and 73.
Is there an oil weapon anymore today?
Not like there was in 1973. I don't think anyone is very worried about unified joint Arab oil embargo like 1973. But there are all kinds of disruptions that we could imagine to the oil market. We saw one of them with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. That severely disrupted the world markets for oil and natural gas. And a lot of Russian oil that had been going to Europe is redirected now. And a lot of that natural gas trade stopped. We could imagine if the United States were to impose even tighter sanctions on Iran that could take oil off the market, outbreak of fighting between Iran and any of the Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates that could take oil off the market. So we can imagine scenarios where the flow of oil from the Middle East would be disrupted. But I think an embargo like 1973, that's not really in the cards anymore.
As I mentioned before, what happened in the 70s, or the two oil shocks, reshaped American politics. And we're still having similar conversations today about the need to diversify our energy sources, not just where we get our oil, but all energy sources. Solar panels, electric vehicles. We see the Biden administration subsidizing electric vehicle industry, right? In your view, Victor, what are, if any, the lasting consequences of the embargo that are still, the 73 embargo, that are still evident, still rippling today?
One big one is the American focus on energy security and energy independence, which became a buzzword of American politics after 1973. And you're right that was one argument for a lot of the policies that have reshaped American energy consumption. more focus on energy conservation, on alternatives to foreign oil imports. One reason for that fracking revolution that we talked about is the U.S. government invested in new technologies for energy production, including fracking, new kinds of fossil fuel production that could replace foreign energy imports. The U.S. government also invested in alternatives to oil altogether. So that included electric vehicles and wind and solar production and so forth. Some of those investments took a long time to pay off, but they are paying off now. So one reason why the United States has less to worry today about a oil disruption is that we're starting to get more alternatives to oil in some sectors, and electric vehicles are a really prominent example of that. 10 or 20 years from now, we may need to use less gasoline. I certainly hope we'll need to use a lot less gasoline because electric vehicles and other alternatives will be available.
Yeah, the politics are still sensitive here. Just see what happens anytime the price of gasoline goes up significantly. I don't know anyone other than folks like you who can explain how a price of a gallon of gasoline is determined. Yet, the president will get blamed for higher gas prices, whether he has anything to do with it or not. But clearly, we don't really rely on Middle Eastern oil as much as we used to. We're still, however, finding ourselves, put it maybe not so sophisticated fashion, stuck in that quagmire there. And you mentioned the end of the 70s and ensuring access to oil, the free flow of oil in that region. This is the Carter Doctrine from his 1980 State of the Union address. His last full year in office, he talks about militarizing the U.S. presence in the Middle East. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. We had what was going on in Iran, that a power hostile to the U.S. wouldn't somehow gobble up all the oil. The risk theory of international relations, the board game Risk, where you can sweep through one country after another, then suddenly you've gone all the way across Asia and Africa with a few rolls of the dice. And this is not really a question, Victor, so I'm sorry if you're getting lost in my maze-like sentences here. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's still a lot of confusion about how all this works.
That's a good reminder that even though an embargo like 73 probably isn't going to happen again, American consumers are still exposed to the impact of high oil prices, and events in the Middle East still affect those prices. So Americans certainly notice when the price of gasoline goes up. You also bring up an important point about 1979. There's a second oil shock that happens in 1979 because of the Iranian Revolution that takes a lot of oil supplies off the market, and we get a second round of lines at gasoline stations, of very high energy prices in the United States. And politically, it really hurts Jimmy Carter. That's one reason why he loses to Ronald Reagan in 1980. In an effort to deal with that crisis, he announces the Carter Doctrine, which, as you said, it's a promise to intervene in the Persian Gulf by any means necessary, including military force, if there's any outside threat to the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf.
The region, which is now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan, is of great strategic importance. It contains more than 2/3 of the world's exportable oil. The Soviet effort to dominate Afghanistan has brought Soviet military forces to within 300 miles of the Indian Ocean and close to the Straits of Hormuz, a waterway through which most of the world's oil must flow. The Soviet Union is now attempting to consolidate a strategic position, therefore, that poses a grave threat to the free movement of Middle East oil. Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
That's one of the policy moves that paved the way for American intervention in the Gulf War in 1990 and 91, and a whole series of U.S. military deployments to the Middle East after that have lasted all the way down to the present day.
Thank you for clearly answering a rather confusing question, if we can call it that. But yeah, I mean, the idea that Saddam Hussein wasn't going to sell his oil, right, after he went into Kuwait, that we needed to invade to secure the oil supply there, I don't think that's true, but politics intercedes, right?
The 1973 embargo was a traumatic experience for the United States, and American policymakers conclude after that point that they can never leave a hostile country in control of oil supplies that the United States might need. So that is one reason, as you say, for intervention in the Persian Gulf War in 1990 and 91. The idea that if Saddam Hussein had control of Iraqi oil and Kuwaiti oil, and maybe if he'd gone further and invaded Saudi Arabia, if he'd had that much control over the world oil supply, he could impose another embargo. He could use oil as a political tool, and the United States wasn't willing to let that happen.
First, from the standpoint of the nations in the Mideast, none of them, Israel, Egypt, Syria, none of them can or should go through the agony of another war. The losses in this war on both sides have been very, very high. And the tragedy must not occur again. There have been 4 of these wars, as you ladies and gentlemen know, over the past 20 years. But beyond that, it is vitally important to the peace of the world that this potential trouble spot, which is really one of the most potentially explosive areas in the world, that it not become an area in which the major powers come together in confrontation.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Lumumba Plot. In the early 1960s, the CIA helped overthrow the democratically elected leader of Congo. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.